Hello and welcome to the Feminists Against Antisemitism podcast. Today I am sitting down with Izabella Tabarovsky, the author of a brilliant new book, Be a Refusenik, a Jewish student's survival guide. Born in the Soviet Union, Izabella Tabarovsky brings both lived experience and rigorous scholarship to her work on Soviet antisemitism and its global afterlives. She is a writer, historian, and one of the leading scholars tracing intellectual and political genealogy of modern antizionism. We explore how the Soviet regime engineered antizionism as a socially acceptable vehicle for antisemitism, recoding hostility towards Jews as moral, progressive, and anti-racist. While much of the West was educated to recognize antisemitism primarily in its Nazi far-right form, Soviet propaganda developed a parallel strain from the left, one that framed Zionism as racism, imperialism, and global conspiracy. That rhetoric did not disappear with the fall of the USSR. It migrated into activist movements, academic institutions, and crucially, into feminist spaces. Isabella's book, Be a Refusenik, takes its inspiration from the Soviet Jewish Refuseniks, men and women who resisted state repression and refused to renounce their identity despite professional ruin, social ostracism, and imprisonment. We examine the parallels Tabarovsky draws between that era and our own, particularly the moral purity tests imposed on Jewish students and activists today. We will also revisit the women of the Refusenik movement, whose organising and courage exposed the myth that resistance was male-led or peripheral to feminist struggle. The Refuseniks teach us something enduring, that small acts of refusal matter, that identity cannot be bargained away for safety, and that moral clarity often begins with the simple act of saying no. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and if you do, please subscribe, follow us on X, and if you're able to, we now have a donation link under the Support Us page on our Substack. Your donations allow us to put on more events, invite more speakers, and to grow this fantastic community. So welcome, Izabella, to Feminists Against Antisemitism, and thank you so much for sitting down with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So for our listeners, Izabella wrote an incredible book, Be a Refusenik, a Jewish student's survival guide. For our people watching on YouTube, you can see it here and you can see all my notes from reading it. Absolutely brilliant book for students and for non-students alike. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Izabella, I wonder if you can start by introducing yourself, telling us a bit about your story and why you decided to write Be a Refusenik.
Sure. So I was born in the USSR, grew up there, and I always, I'm not embarrassed to age myself. I was born in 1970. I say it in every talk because I want people to understand that, I actually experienced 20 years of life in the USSR until we emigrated, or 19 years. We emigrated in 1989 to the United States. A Jewish family at that time, a lot of Jews, most Soviet Jews really were thinking about emigrating. And in the end, most Soviet Jews emigrated over the years. Like around 1 million of them came to Israel, and around 500,000 went to America, which is where my family went, and then a few 100,000 to Germany and some other places. So the USSR fell apart in 1991. We emigrated because of anti-Semitism. We all experienced it, generations. There are stories of anti-Semitism. The USSR was known to the world as a country of state-sponsored anti-Semitism. And when I came to America, I would say that I never experienced a day of anti-Semitism in my life again until around 2018. And when I say I didn't experience a day of anti-Semitism, I mean that, first of all, it's just true overall, but also in the USSR, in the late USSR, Brezhnev's USSR, the 1970s and then 1980s, perestroika time, if you were a Jew, you usually experienced anti-Semitism primarily when you wanted to go to a university. You had to think, does this university accept Jews? Does this faculty accept Jews? Or when you were selecting your profession, you were thinking, are there Jews in this profession? Are Jews allowed in this profession or in this career? So this was a real thinking that you had to do. It was part of my thinking. As I turned 17, I started that was the conversation. Oh, you want to go there? They don't take Jews there. So so in my life in America, I never experienced any of it. I went to good universities. I got my master's at Harvard, and then I had really good jobs. I lived on the East Coast mostly. Again, never, ever, ever my Jewishness came up as a factor in any of it. And then in 2018, I saw an item on the news with students on an American campus holding placards declaring that Zionism is racism and say that Israel is an apartheid state. And that sort of called forth some memories, big memories, long forgotten memories that I couldn't really form or put words around them. And I called my dad and told him about it. And basically from the conversation with him, he said, oh, yeah, we've heard things like we've heard all of this before. And I thought, wow, okay, this is why it sounds so familiar. And so that put me on this exploration of, why am I hearing this stuff here in America? Why am I hearing it now? Because I know that I hadn't heard it before. I was on American campuses in the 1990s, University of Colorado in Boulder, and then at Harvard. There was none of this there. And why is it here? And also, I realized that the language repeated itself almost verbatim, almost 100% correspondence. What students on campuses were saying in America in 2018, 19, 20, 21, versus what we heard. And I thought, well, you don't just reinvent language like this from scratch. It's very idiosyncratic. You don't just, you just don't. It just doesn't happen. So there must have been channels of transmission. And so I went around looking for those channels of transmission, spent a lot of time actually in the British Library because I wanted to see what the British left said about Israel and Zionism in the early 1970s and also throughout the 1970s, 1980s. And I looked specifically at publications that I knew were Soviet aligned, and definitely I knew that definitely received Soviet funding, or most likely received Soviet funding because of their hard alignment with the USSR. So, and I could see that the language was already there, and then there was scholarly literature that confirmed that there was this change of language on the left in the West in the way it talked about Israel and Zionism. And that turn happened in 1967. We can talk about that. But basically by the early 70s, the Western left was already speaking in this language that we're hearing today about Zionism and Israel. And so this has been my work and my contribution really to the understanding of anti-Zionism. And then I wrote this book also, because in parallel, I was also writing about the Soviet Jewish activists who lived at the same time, 1970s, 1980s, like Natan Sharansky, maybe some of your listeners know, who were dissidents, who fought for their Jewish rights under the USSR, and who I long felt were a model for American Jews in what was already developing as this extremely hostile environment in the academy and elsewhere. And so I was writing about them. And so then I wrote the book, Be a Refusenik. Essentially, I drew lessons from that Soviet Jewish activism during the Cold War and compared it to what's going on campuses today. I interviewed the Refuseniks and I interviewed the students from today and drew some lessons. And this is what the book is, because I feel like we talk a lot about fighting anti-Semitism. And we don't really, in the Jewish community, we don't talk enough about what is it that we're fighting for. We know what we're fighting against, but what are we fighting for? And how do we do it so that we feel empowered as opposed to feeling like victims? This is a very long answer to your short question.
It's a very detailed answer, but every word of it. And that's something that actually really came through the book, and I want to talk about as we go through this interview, is that defiance, that pride, and how that was there and why that was there, and how the Jewish people turned from being sort of the victims in the story, the Holocaust, the pogroms, to being victorious to winning the battles and to suddenly having this sense of national pride with the creation of Israel. But I wonder if we can start by going back a little bit and setting the scene as to what it was like in the USSR, post-Holocaust, sort of between that time up until the Refusenik movement. We know and we understand from the work that you've done and from uncovering this that the language was there within the USSR of the Zionism is racism, and a lot of what we're seeing today. But how did it get there? If we can just set the scene for a little bit.
Yeah. So as I said, the turning point in all of it was 67. So if we look at before 1967, we actually need to go even a little bit further. I usually do that very briefly in my lectures because the Soviets were really always, and I'm using the Soviets here as a general term for the Bolsheviks or the communists or the socialists. These words were interchanged and they depended on the era of which we're speaking about. The position against Zionists was there from the beginning, and it was determined by many factors, some of which are kind of understandable. And I say it because I think that there are actually links from today to back there. I think when we understand that, it helps us understand some of the foundational ideas that underlie the anti-Zionist positions of the left, except that today they're so extreme that they actually are they're far removed from what it was like in the early 20th century. But still, it's important to understand. So the Bolsheviks were communists or socialists. Let's not get into the difference right now. That meant that they were internationalists. And that meant that they believed that once the socialist revolution comes, all nations will be equal. There will be no discrimination, or all ethnic groups will be equal. What will matter is that there will be no discrimination. What will matter is that proletariat of all countries will unite to fight for its own interests, right? The class struggle, right? The Marxist foundation of it all. So the workers of all countries will unite, and it won't matter whether the worker is Jewish, German, Russian, American, Black American. It wouldn't matter. And Zionism was a nationalist ideology. And so just on that foundation alone, for that reason alone, that was enough for them to be against it. But there were other reasons as well. They had to do with the fact that the Bolsheviks, which was the party that executed the revolution, felt that Zionists were kind of competing for the loyalties of the Jewish masses. And they really needed the Jewish masses to be with them because the Jews were very, very poor, really deprived of rights, probably the most oppressed group in the Russian Empire. And so that was another reason. And so there were theoretical, there were practical and political reasons why they were against Zionists, okay? So then the revolution happens, and the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, say, okay, so you Jews, we remove all discrimination, we put an end to pogroms, and they did. And they also, by the way, were against the Tsarist anti-Semitism. The Tsarist Empire was extremely anti-Semitic. There were pogroms, kind of organized attacks on Jews, murderous, horrible, which actually pushed millions of Jews to emigrate to America. And so the Bolsheviks come and they say, okay, we put an end to pogroms. We don't stand for it. And you Jews, all limitations are lifted. You can join us in the building of the socialist state. You have all the rights like us. Essentially, just two requests. We don't like nationalists. We don't like religion. So we're all atheists. So, if you don't practice Judaism and if you don't stand for Zionism, then you're fine. You can be with us. And so, in principle, for the first decade of the Soviet power, Jews are doing more or less well, unless they do believe that Jews are a nation and should actually build their own nation in Palestine, which is a response to pogroms, horrible, horrible pogrom and anti-Semitism of the Russian Empire in Europe. And unless you're a religious Jew, which there were, and then you were in the underground, eventually you could be executed for that, sent to the Gulag, the concentration camps. Okay. So that happens. So then Stalin comes to power in the 1930s, and the country gradually becomes more nationalist, more there's repressions, really horrible, horrible repressions. Then the war comes. I'm skipping through a lot of stuff, but already under Stalin, the country begins to change. What used to be internationalist now is replaced by a far more nationalistic conservative culture. And then after the war, so the attitude really begins to change during the war. During the Holocaust, this is something that a lot of your listeners may not know, but in the Holocaust, out of the 6 million Jews who were murdered, approximately 2.8 million, this is the estimate, were Jews who were murdered in Soviet territories. So about a third. And this matters because there, Jews were not murdered, in concentration or in death camps. They were murdered. They started to be murdered en masse much earlier, from summer of 1941. And they were murdered en masse by hand, by shooting. This is what's often known as the shooting Holocaust. And so, 2.8 million Soviet Jews, or Jews who were in the Soviet territories, they weren't all Soviet citizens. They were Jews who were pushed eastward by the Nazis from Poland. Anyway, so 2.8 million of them are murdered by the Nazis. And so then after the war, it's a much diminished population, but by numbers, and they obviously by numbers, this is where the genocide of Jews was most complete. If you look at, it says, I'm getting into details. I was afraid that we would get into a lot of details, but, feel free to just cut out whatever you want. But this is another important fact, is that, the genocide was most complete in those Soviet territories that were occupied by the Nazis. So lots of Soviet Jews managed to flee eastward, but those who stayed, 98% of them were murdered. In other countries in Western Europe, the difference was, like 15 to, there was the survival rate was 15% to about 60%, I think. It depended on the country. In the USSR, the survival rate for Jews under Nazi occupation was 2%. So it's a true, true, real genocide. But the war ends, and Stalin's leadership prohibits Jews to commemorate that, prohibits any hints at the idea that Jews were really the primary victim and target of the Nazis. And then, so the country is becoming now particularly nationalist, Russian nationalist, even though Stalin is Georgian. But then the question of establishment of Israel comes along, and Stalin's leadership supports it because he thinks that geopolitically it would benefit the USSR. It's not that he suddenly became Zionist. He says, okay, in Israel, first of all, there are a lot of collective farms, kibbutzim, that are very socialist in orientation and communist and not just pro-Soviet, but actually pro-Stalinist. He gets that intelligence and he thinks, okay, well, this will, if that state is established, they will become a good platform for us to push back on the British Empire in the Middle East. And so the USSR votes for the establishment of the State of Israel, and it was a crucial vote. Without it, it wouldn't have happened. But then some things happen, and Stalin very quickly becomes paranoid about the fact that Soviet Jews are so excited about the establishment of the State of Israel. They are following Soviet leadership and writing and saying, we want to go and fight in the War of Independence. So basically, Stalin decides that he now has the fifth column on his hands, Jewish fifth column. And this is, as I said earlier, so the Soviets were always anti-Zionist, but the quality of their anti-Zionism changed. So early on, they had their theoretical, their practical, their political reasons, okay? It was, if you are not Marxist, you would disagree with what they were saying, but at least it's understandable. Or it's connected to reality. You get to late Stalin, late 40s, early 50s, you start to see conspiracist language permeating conversation about Jews and Zionists, meaning that it's a return of old anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Because anti-Semitism is always fundamentally what makes it different from other forms of prejudice is that there is a conspiracy theory involved. And so now the Soviets are using, the Soviet leadership, Stalin's leadership, is using conspiracist language when speaking about Zionists, saying that Zionists control the world, that kind of thing. Zionists are out there trying to undermine the Soviet Union. Jews with Zionist loyalties want to poison the Kremlin leadership. Completely disproportionate. I want to explain for your listeners who maybe are not sensitized to this. Israel is a tiny country, and Zionism is an ideology that pertains to just a few million people. When you start saying that Zionism is your main ideological enemy and that Zionists all over the world are trying to undermine you, you have blown things so far out of proportion, it's hard to even, it's like, where does this come from? But this corresponds to how classical anti-Semitic conspiracy theory talks about Jews, because Jews are such a small proportion of global population. To say that Jews are plotting to control the world, it's a conspiracy theory. So Stalin's regime is starting to imply these things about Zionists. And that's when this language first begins to permeate left-wing language about Zionists and Israel. And then Stalin dies in 1953. But the language stays, and there is, so under Khrushchev comes to power, and there is, the country is still as hostile to Israel and Zionism, but it really all comes to a head in 1967, when the Six-Day War happens in June of 1967, and Israel, contrary to all expectations, wins. And it doesn't just win over the Arab states; it wins over states that are allies of the USSR, that the USSR financed and sponsored and trained. And so it really sets off a panic in Moscow. They can't understand how it is that such a small country won over countries that they had trained and financed and armed. And this is when, that old thinking takes over, the idea that, well, clearly, there's some global Zionist conspiracy that's operating behind the scenes against Moscow, against Soviet interests. So we must fight it all over the world. And so this is when I notionally call it, again, it's very notional, but I call it the third stage of Soviet anti-Zionism. This is when Soviet anti-Zionism goes, it's not just conspirological, but it goes global, because until the understanding largely stayed in the USSR, but in 1967 it goes global. And this is when these slogans that we hear today, equating Zionism with all of humanity's worst ills, like racism and fascism and Nazism and apartheid, imperialism, colonialism, this is when they get kind of developed and practiced and really spread around the globe.
It's really interesting. You talk about the Six-Day War, and there's a story. I think it's Sharansky's. One of his stories is that he was watching or saw the images of three IDS soldiers gazing in awe at the Western Wall. Yeah, I've got that right. Good. Just trying to remember it exactly. And having that picture sort of printed and on his wall, and having that pride and that hope and that determinism that we can actually do this, that we can go to our homeland, we can pray in our homeland, we can become something, and we can win, we can survive, and that sort of sowed the seeds for the Refusenik movement.
I'm not sure if he had that picture on his wall. He had a picture of Yoni Netanyahu, the brother of Benjamin Netanyahu, who was part of the special services, part of the group that attempted to or rescued hostages in Uganda. But he certainly at some point he does see, it's a very famous picture of young, Israeli paratroopers when they first enter the old city, because, until 1967, Israel did not include the old city of Jerusalem. It was part of the Jordanian territory. The old city was part of Jordan. And so when they first entered, and these are such legendary, it's such a legendary place. Legendary is not even right. It's like it occupies such a central place in Jewish spirituality, right? In Judaism, that they walk in and they look at those mythic places. And I think what Sharansky realized then is that, there were young people. He realizes these young people were his age. And he says to himself, it's a moment of awakening for him. And he's like, wow, these young people participated in something so, such a turning point for the Jewish nation. And why am I sitting here in this country that hates Jews, that oppresses Jews? What am I doing here? I want to be with my people. It's like it's an awakening of national consciousness for him. And also the Six-Day War served that as that for many Soviet Jews, that all of a sudden they realized that being Jewish is not only associated with being oppressed or being denied something or being targeted. It can also mean doing great things. And it also means doing things that make you feel proud.
It really struck me when I read that story. We have, I don't know if you've heard of them, I'm sure you probably have. There's an Irish band called Kneecap. Not Kneecap. Oh, I get confused. There's Bob Dylan. I get confused. I don't listen to their music, but they're on the news all the time. Yeah, there's Bob Dylan and Kneecap, and they shout "Death to the IDF," and that's their
Yes, Bob Dylan. Is that his last name?
I think so. Yeah. Actually, very well-to-do, got a double-barrel surname, but that's not cool when you want to be a punk. Yeah. So, yeah. And that chant, people say, means one thing. It's meaningless. It's not genocidal, or it's not anti-Semitic or anything like that. And sometimes it's hard to connect why words have the impact they have and what they mean. And reading that story, it made me realize that the IDF just isn't just an army. It's through the actions of the IDF, Jewish people were able to return to their homeland, to return to these spiritual places, to pray, to practice, and to be safe, and have a place where, for the first time, ever almost, they were safe. And that by chanting death to the IDF, what that actually means when you look at the sort of the subtext underneath it.
Right. Well, it's very interesting because, obviously the IDF exists, it's Israel Defense Forces, right? So its primary target is to defend the country, to defend the Jewish people, because, Jews are there's constantly someone who wants to invade and plans and announces that it will murder all the Israelis, right? But so if you want to come and fight the IDF in open battle, it's one thing. When you chant death to the IDF, I mean, what does it really mean? It's like you're basically calling for a mass slaughter of essentially all Israelis, because, I mean, not all Israelis serve, but the idea is that, it's the city, like it's a civilian army, right? To a considerable degree, all Israelis serve in the army. And so, I mean, death to anything, that's just not a nice chant, let's put it that way. But certainly for Jews, it very much resonates with, okay, well, that's just another substitute for Jew. So that's...
Yeah. Yeah. So moving on then, so we get to the end of the Six-Day War. We see Israel succeed against all odds. We see this sense of pride and achievement, and this idea of something bigger in Israel, and there's this mass movement of Soviet Jews who want to emigrate. I wonder if you can sort of, through that, explain what is a Refusenik and how did that movement come about from that point?
Yeah. So 67, Israel's victory stimulates this surge of Jewish pride, and a lot of Jews are asking to emigrate. But, this is something I've realized that a lot of people actually don't know today, especially younger people, that you couldn't emigrate from the Soviet Union. It was a closed country. And the USSR resists it, and it denies exit visas for these Soviet Jews. And when they get these denials, I mean, first of all, once they apply, you can't just apply quietly. In order to apply, you have to essentially declare to everyone in your circle that you're going to apply. And that means because you need to collect documents from them that they have to sign off, that your spouse has to sign off, your parents, your boss, your, professors at your university, that they don't mind basically letting you go, or that you don't owe anything to the school. But by that process, essentially, the idea is that you announce yourself as being a disloyal citizen, as someone who wants to leave this socialist paradise, supposedly. And so there's the idea of kind of inducing the social shame. But also, so once you have declared that you want to leave, even when you have been refused the visa, Everybody now knows, and you just get kicked out of everywhere you were, out of school, off you get fired from your job. And so people get marginalized, and they're called refuseniks because they were refused these exit visas. But what I say in the book is that there is also another way to look at this term. And this is how the leadership of the movement that begins to form thought of themselves. They thought, you know what, before you refused us the visa, we refused your entire system. We refused this setup, among other things, right? We refused the setup in which we're supposed to assimilate into your country, which is so anti-Semitic, which hates us so much. We refuse to assimilate into the idea that Jews are not a people. Basically, your deal to us is, get what you want, but just acknowledge that you're not part of the Jewish people, that you don't need by then, by the way, all of the kind of every aspect of Jewishness, cultural, religious, every national is completely removed from Soviet Jewish life. Okay, it goes underground. So much of it is prohibited. Nobody is allowed to learn Hebrew, or if yes, then only under very controlled environments in some special universities. Maybe you are allowed so that you can then go and serve the state. So so like Jews are defined as Jews, but all of everything that actually is associated with Jewishness is eliminated. And so the refuseniks are saying, well, we refuse this deal. We want to know Hebrew, and we want to be connected to Israel, and we want to be connected to Jewish culture and religion. And if you don't let us emigrate, well, then we're going to sit here until you let us. And we are going to study all of this. We're going to learn what it actually means to be Jewish. And I think that is an incredibly heroic thing that they do. It's something that people often forget. This movement for Soviet Jewry that arose in the West in support of Soviet Jews focused on immigration. So it's remembered as a movement for Soviet Jewish immigration. But again, what these activists are doing, and they start to create Hebrew language circles, essentially, where there is, somebody who learned, a couple hundred words of Hebrew starts to teach others, and then others start teaching others. And these become centers of knowledge about Judaism and Israel and Zionism. And they begin to reclaim all of it, So they're saying, okay, as long as we're sitting here, we're going to become real Jews. And there is actually a book by one of those activists who was in refusal for like 20 years, Yulia Kosharovsky, which is titled, "We Are Jews Again." This is literally the title. It's like when they, after years of study, are able to say, we are Jews again. You called us Jews before, but it is only now that we are Jews that we have learned what we needed to learn.
I really like that way of turning it around and saying, actually, you didn't refuse us, we refused you. And in doing so, that actually revitalized that connection to being Jewish, learning history, learning Hebrew, learning the religious festivals. There was one story, I can't remember the name, one of the Refuseniks who was taught how to celebrate Hanukkah properly for the first time, and now is an Orthodox rabbi in Israel, from that not having any idea about his religion and where he came from in that way. There was also, so throughout the book, you share some of the history, and then you look at the parallels of what's happening today. And a lot of that I could really connect to. I'm a student, I may be in my 40s, but I've gone to university. I'm doing a master's in a big, well-known university in London. And whilst it may not be as obvious as having to label yourself as a Jew, there is this insidious nature of, in order to be accepted by the group, you have to disavow any connection to Israel. You have to confirm that you're not a genocidal baby killer. And I remember a few years ago, probably a year after October 7th, the camps, we have the camps on university campuses. I was in some group work. I'm doing a psychotherapy course, so there's a lot of sort of group talking about our feelings. And I remember witnessing Irish, white, very well-to-do man, basically questioning these two Israeli female students as to whether they were a good Jew or a bad Jew. And I sort of I got to the point where I just couldn't watch it anymore, and I had to interject because these poor women who are friends of mine would just sort of sit there going, how do I even respond to this? And everyone's watching and everyone's waiting, and you have to disavow. And it's quite horrifying that this is happening today. We're in, 2026. This is what, we're talking about 1960s, 1970s USSR. The parallels are horrifying.
Yeah. Yeah, well, look, it's become, as I mentioned, this attitude toward Israel has become so much part of the left-wing DNA that I think people don't even question it. They don't understand how hypocritical they are, right? Because the left has been the defender of minorities and it's really part of the left wing kind of story from the beginning for as long as we know it. The defender of the weak, right? The defender um, of those who face discrimination, and they just don't even understand how contradictory it is for them to be doing what you just described, to be attacking two Jewish women from that kind of perspective. I mean, the left also for the last many years has talked to us about microaggressions and to be really attuned to the fine tones that we use when we speak about or to people of other cultures and other ethnic groups. And here it's full-on aggression against Jewish students, ignoring questions of power at all, power imbalances. So it's really, this is what's so extraordinary about it, I think. I mean, extraordinary and not so extraordinary. It always somehow, when there's an explosion of anti-Semitism, I think very often the hypocrisy is the first thing that shows up, that it's like the rules apply to everybody, but not to Jews. Jews are always the exception. And I think we've seen it since October 7th. We saw it in America in that infamous congressional testimony by three presidents of three American universities, where, they couldn't answer the question of whether it's against their rules and code of behavior to call for genocide of Jews on their campus, when if you said these words about any other minority group, right? Sexual minority, ethnic minority, racial minority, they would be able to answer this question without mincing words at all. So this is what's so shocking. But what I was going to say is that I think part of the reason, it's probably very complex, but part of the reason that I see, because of the lens that I look through, is that it's because it's been part of the left for so long. It's like from the early 70s, essentially. If you want to have street cred as a leftist, you have to accept several things, right? Among them is that you're anti-imperialist, you're anti-colonialist, you're anti-capitalist, but also at some point, at least amongst a portion of the left, another thing that you have to accept as a given is that you're also anti-Israel, because Israel is associated with all of these things. And again, this is when Soviet propaganda works so hard to spread this idea throughout the world and targeting left-wing groups in particular. So they take it on and embrace it. And I think that since then, it's just been passed down the generations of left-wing activists without really questioning it. And that's why we see what we see. It's one of the reasons, I think that, again, I think that I think the things are very complex, but I think that this is one of the reasons.
I really like the way in your book that you refer to it as the academic bullshit bubble.
Not my phrase. It's the phrase of one of my heroines, one of the activists I interviewed. I love that phrase too.
Fantastic. Who was that? Marina?
No, it was Adela Kohab. She's a young, very promising young lawyer who was an activist at NYU in around 2018, 2019, and she became famous for, I think she was probably the first one to sue her school on Title VI grounds, basically for discrimination against Jews. So she was very brave, because I don't think there were suits like that before. If there were, they weren't very prominent or well known.
I remember this, yeah, very, very brave woman. And there's a few incredibly brave students that you do profile in the book. And it really resonated with that, having to push back using sort of official channels, having to go all outside and sue the universities. We have a very different structure here in the UK, but there are organizations trying to push back against this, academic bullshit. And, we're getting papers set on a regular basis that position Jewish people as white oppressors, papers that refer to Palestinian suicide bombers as victims, who, what else could they do? They were so oppressed. And actually, it's the fault of Israelis and therefore Jewish people. And it's unquestioned and unchallenged. And when you do try and challenge it, we did successfully get a paper taken down that was due to be discussed on October 7th last year. And was just full of anti-Semitic blood libels. It wasn't even just, borderline. It was horrific. And we banded together and managed to get that paper removed thanks to the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which our university adopted. But even in winning when I say legally, we won the complaint, the paper was taken down. There was no acknowledgement that, yes, it was anti-Semitic, even though we won that complaint. But there was also this insinuation that we may have been right, but we were somehow bigoted, unable to understand another lived experience, and our fitness to be psychotherapists was questioned, even though we won on every single count. And that's the sort of upside down world we're living in, where you can be right and still cast as the bigot.
Right. Well, this is really such a difficult moment. I remember first realizing, I think it was right around 2020, is when it's the first summer of the pandemic, and everybody is locked up and online, and this is when we have the Twitter storms, I think they were called, when people get canceled through Twitter, there's like mobs descending on people who did or said something wrong. And this is, I think, the first time that I saw really just this incredible explosion of anti-Semitism online. And it could be just because I was spending more time online myself, because we were all online. And I remember thinking how strange and strange is not the right word, like disappointing, heartbreaking, even maybe it is, to see the fact that you actually don't have to have a totalitarian or authoritarian regime dictating to you what you should do. The society will arrange itself around these radical ideas, around these very illiberal ideas that are really very totalitarian in their principle, right? Because it's like you're not entitled to a different opinion. They don't want to hear you. A person is not entitled to defense because they're Jewish and therefore they may be a Zionist and or an Israeli or associated with white oppressors. So all of us, somehow the society, despite its declared principles, despite the freedoms, despite this idea that America is a free country, and I just speak from the American point of view, somehow the society arranged itself in a way to accommodate the most radical points of view, because people retreat, people are afraid to go against these points of view, because they begin to self-censor. So you don't need, it turns out, that's when I learned that you don't need a government to censor you. You can choose to self-censor if there are radical voices that are strong enough and loud enough and have a cover that cover themselves under this umbrella of justice, that we know what justice is and we know what's right. And that's enough for the society, for many in the society, to shut up and just follow that and not say anything. And it's actually a terrifying thought to me, because if you don't need a government, it's one thing when you have a government like the Iranian regime, right, that suppresses everything and everyone and goes after people with violence and has the monopoly on power and on violence. But how does free society defend itself if the voices that could do it actually choose to self-censor? That's I'd love to hear, there must be studies, in social psychology about this. But, when how radicals take over free society, even when the government is not part of that, that's a really terrifying thing to think about and to see. And I don't yet fully know the answer, except for those of us who are, the few who choose to fight. But I think there should be more, because I know that more people care, but they choose not to do anything. They choose not to join in the fight.
And absolutely, the silent majority, I think, do see what's going on and don't agree with it, but are too scared to speak. We do have a bit of a free speech crisis. And I might say a bit, we do. We have a free speech crisis on our university campuses here in the UK, the US, I know, are having the same. We have, again, different ways of working, different legal frameworks, but there's been studies done to show students are self-censoring. And on the plus side, I think people are getting fed up with it. And we're seeing more going, I'm fed up of being silenced. I am actually going to speak my piece. And that's something that came through with all of the stories you were telling, both of modern day students and of the Refuseniks, of the sort of shaking off that censorship, shaking off the silencing and being loud, being proud, whatever may come from that. And in USSR, that was the gulags, that was the labor camps, that was, losing your job, losing your position, being tortured, horrendous stories. Today, it's the cancellation, it's the mob, but there's also that violence. We've seen, obviously, anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic violence erupting, obviously in Bondi in Australia, the Hanukkah massacre. We had it here on Yom Kippur, I think it was, in Manchester. And in America, the two Israeli, the couple that were murdered. And all of this creates that culture of silence. And so to speak is such an incredibly brave thing to do. I wonder, there's so many stories we could explore, but we're already nearly been chatting for an hour. I think you may need to extend. But I wonder for you, is there a favorite story that you have in the book of resistance?
Oh my gosh, that's such among contemporary students.
Contemporary and historic, perhaps.
Wow. Well, there are so many. I'll mention one historical one and maybe one contemporary one. But the historical one is one that I actually begin the book with. It's in chapter 1. And this is a Refusenik with a complicated long last name, Boris Kochubievsky. And the reason I like that story is that he was among the first. He was among the first who simply followed. It's very much along the lines of what we were just talking about. He is in a repressive society, which after 1967 mandates meetings all around the country at every workplace to condemn Israel as an aggressor, which of course Israel wasn't the aggressor, but this is Israel's the aggressor. Israel is occupying Arab lands. Israel's the oppressor. At some point, they also add the charge of genocide very quickly. But so, and he's an engineer in a factory in Kiev. And, so I imagine it's a big factory. I imagine them gathering. It's a huge meeting. I can visualize these meetings because I have been there, huge meeting. Typically, people just come there to these meetings, these political education meetings, and they know what's expected of them. They don't pay attention to the speeches at the front. They maybe sit and read a book or a newspaper. They are thinking about their own thing. And they know that the only thing that's expected of them is to raise their hand at the end when there is a vote. So the vote here is for a resolution, basically condemning Israel. Why are they doing it? Because they want to be able to say, it's a performance. The Soviet people have unanimously condemned Israel as an aggressor, etc., etc. So they just know, they come prepared to raise their hand and go home, and that's it. But he refuses. He does not do that. Here's this word refuse. I think it's a very powerful word, actually, to refuse what others want you to do, to refuse to go with the crowd. And he raises his hand and he says, I don't believe what you just said here. I believe that Israel was not an aggressor. I believe that Israel has the right to defend itself, and I have the right to say it. And just that one thing can create such a crisis in a machine that seems to be so, well put together, so powerful. And of course, there are consequences. That machine puts pressure on him with all of its weight because they really need unanimity. But it also means that he really puts them into this crisis mode. They crack at this one voice of dissent. Imagine if there were 10 or 15 people who dissented, but he's the only one. Anyway, so it's a story. I think it's a very powerful story. And in the end, he's tried and he's sent to the Gulag. He writes an essay called Why I Am a Zionist. And this essay reads so contemporary to me because today, the story that I paired him with is about Columbia University students who write an essay where basically they say, this is why we're Zionists. It's extraordinary to see the parallel. Today, young American Jews are forced to define themselves as Zionists because they explain how that connects to their sense of identity. And this is what that guy does before. So that to me is extremely powerful. And he became, I think, the first concrete figure that the Soviet Jewry movement abroad could fight for. And so that's really important. And I'll say just one thing generally about all the young activists that I profile. I truly can't pick a single story. They're all so awe-inspiring to me. But I'll say that, it's very similar to Soviet Jews. They enter the universities not planning to fight anything. Especially those, and everybody I profiled entered the universities before October 7th. And some even graduated before October 7th, but some were on campuses during October 7th. But so for all of them, they enter schools just like any other 18-year-old would. They have their ambitions, they have their desires, their interests. They don't plan to be fighting on behalf of the Jewish people. And then at some point, and this is a metaphor that I use often because I do think that it really fits. At some point in their journey, they see a burning bush. For those who are not familiar with this metaphor, it's a metaphor from the Bible. Moses, at some point, when he's expelled from Pharaoh's palace and he wanders around, and at some point he sees a burning bush. And Moses has a choice to pass by that burning bush. It's a very unusual. It's a burning bush that doesn't get consumed. It keeps burning, right? The fire keeps going. The bush doesn't get consumed by the fire. He can just pass on by, but he chooses to go over and look. And when he comes, there is a voice that comes and gives him his mission to go and save his people. And there's a conversation at the bush. And so at some point, all these young people come across a burning bush and they choose to stop and look and listen and understand. And when they do, once they do, it's like they can't refuse the mission because the mission is like they understand that they can't. They have to take it on and do what they can, and they all do. And I think it's really powerful. And in a way, I think the book is one aspect of the book is it's a book of personal transformation. It's a story of how you find meaning in something that you never really necessarily thought you would find meaning in, but you can't decline this purpose and this mission because it feels so important in the moment. And I think that's really what this book is about.
That's really beautiful. A lovely way to imagine it with the burning bush story there. And I think I've seen that happen with Jewish friends of mine who, when we started the course pre-October 7th, were perhaps ambivalent about their connection to Israel. They hadn't questioned it particularly too much, very left-wing themselves, given to many Palestinian and Israeli peace causes, and just sort of, had experienced perhaps some anti-Semitism as kids going to Jewish school, but, nothing really that major. And then what they've been confronted with over the last few years has not only driven a greater connection to Israel and to their Jewishness, but for some have found them picking up the, taking the baton, picking up the mantle to fight in a way they did didn't think they would. And some I know are quite exhausted by that and don't wish they didn't have to do it. Others, find meaning from that. Going back to the Refuseniks, then there was a lot of stories. I say there are so many stories, to pick one is very difficult. But looking at some of the cost to speaking up back then. So Marina, I mentioned her earlier. Her story kind of stuck with me from that sort of woman's perspective of what it was like to go through that. Women, what I loved about this is often when you read a history sort of book, this is a history book, this is looking at both today and the past. But often, you hear the phrase pale, male, and stale. And there's a lot of men names, and the women kind of get written out. What I love about this book is the women, and not just the book, but about the movement. Women were a key part of it, and women were there. They were activists. They were proud. They did what they could. They were also threatened and jailed and harmed. And Marina talks about the sexual violence, the threats of sexual violence, the obstetric violence. They threatened to murder her while she was giving birth, and they nearly did. And I wonder if you can share with us a bit about the story of women throughout this movement.
Well, yeah, I mean, women activists, women were an important part of the movement. I think that, yeah, I mean, they were right there. One of the characters, one of the chapters that describes the story of Leningrad hijackers. So this was a group of young Jews who were actually from Riga, and some were from Leningrad, which today is St. Petersburg, but most were from Riga, who decide in a moment of desperation that they want to attract attention to their cause. And so they decide that they want to hijack an airplane. They want to hijack an empty airplane because they don't want to harm anyone, and they don't want to look like Palestinian hijackers who at that time in the early 70s were hijacking a lot of passenger airplanes. And so they decide they want to hijack a small airplane and fly it so that the only people on the plane would be them. It's a group of about 14 people. Or 16, and that they would fly over the border in northern Russia, from Leningrad. It's very close to the border with Finland. And they thought that they would fly over Finland because Finland, they didn't trust. It was very close to the USSR. They would fly to Sweden. And then they would, once they're there, they would land there. They actually had a former Soviet military pilot and, as one of the members of the group. They would give a press conference and they would talk about how horrible the situation for Jews was in the USSR. And one of the leaders of that movement was a woman, Sylva Zalmanson, and she became a real symbol of the movement. She was petite. I mean, she's still with us, thank God. As a young woman, she was petite. She was, just like Marina Foreman, who I described. You would think that they're non-threatening, but the spirit, their spirit was so powerful that the Soviets were really terrified of them. And in the story of Marina, I described how they really wanted to control her every movement. They even wanted to prevent her from marrying the man that she wanted to marry because they felt that, together they would become, he was also refusing, that they would become this unstoppable force. So yeah, women were very much part of the movement. There was another woman, Reza Palatnik, who was actually well known in the UK. In the UK, there was a women's movement for Soviet Jews, the 35s, who really need to be written about. They're completely forgotten. I think none of them have written memoirs. And this is one thing I would say that I've noticed is that a lot of former refuseniks who are men wrote memoirs, and so their stories. I don't know if there is a single former female refusenik who wrote a memoir, and that's a real loss. There are women who were fighting for Soviet Jews in the West, like Pamela Cohen. She wrote a brilliant memoir. She was a real leader in the movement for Soviet Jewry in America. But I think 35s need to be researched. Some of them are still with us. And they took on a woman, Reza Palatnik, and they really fought for her. So yeah, these are really important figures.
I've never heard of the 35s until I was at your book launch in London a couple of weeks ago. And for our listeners, yes, we are exploring that story, and we will bring that story.
I hope so.
Definitely, there are some women that we've managed to connect that are still alive today, and so I'd love to invite you back when we get to the point where we're able to tell that story. And
I'd love to. I'd love to. Absolutely. There were women in Finland who were fighting for Soviet Jewry who were not Jewish. I was really incredibly fortunate to have met them, one of them recently. She was really persecuted. She went into the country delivering um, pieces of equipment that the Refuseniks and also Christian dissidents could put together in order to publish samizdat, self-published literature, which was so important to circulate their ideas and the information. And she was then actually attacked in her own country. I think probably, I'm going to guess that the Soviet embassy probably complained. And so then she was persecuted in her own country, in Finland. So it's there are so many stories that haven't been told that really need to be told.
Looking at that story of women, there was an interesting. I was looking into like how women across the world sort of joined in protesting for and supporting the Refuseniks, and putting pressure on governments to do something about it and to help these Refuseniks to emigrate and be able to move to Israel. And there was some analysis done around the fact that because of feminism and because of sort of the women's movement, these sort of underground groups and networks were kind of already there, so they could be easily deployed and information shared. And looking at that history, it's sort of a double whammy when you think about how feminists have turned against Israeli and Jewish women, especially when you look at the denial of the sexual violence used on October 7th, and rape as a weapon of sort of nationalist torture. I wonder, from your perspective and your history, what's your relationship with feminism, both sort of when you were younger, pre-October 7th and post?
Well, it's really interesting because, so growing up in the USSR, Soviet propaganda ridiculed Western feminists relentlessly from the very beginning, from the suffragette movement all the way into the 70s and 80s. And I could never really understand why. It took me a while to understand. I think they did it because they were trying to say, well, these capitalists, these bourgeois women, what they need basically is to fight for socialist revolution. And then they will have a country like ours. And then where all the women are exactly, women are equal with men. We've achieved in the socialist country, we've achieved full equality between men and women. And so what they need to fight for is socialism. And then they will solve all of their problems, which, of course, the USSR was anything but equal. But, I first encountered feminist thought as a form of kind of study and scholarship. And I think it was at the University of Colorado in Boulder when I first came there. And there was a movement, there was a class on women's studies course. And I was interested. And so I took it. And it really opened my eyes to so much. It was completely eye-opening. It was a revelation. It answered so many questions for me about, so much of it was about body image, for example, and how women are presented in a certain way in external advertisements, and then what it, how it's that line of thought. And that was all completely new to me, and it helped me understand so much about myself. And I would have called myself always a feminist just because of the way I've lived my life. I'm a professional woman. And so much of what feminists have traditionally, I guess you could say, fought for was very much relevant to my life. I guess today they call them second wave feminists. It's people like Phyllis Chesler, who was just on your podcast, and I've met some of them since in the last few years who are just so bitterly disappointed or heartbroken in the responses October 7th, but who also have been seeing feminism moving away from real issues of real concern to real women into some kind of, I don't even know what to call it. So much of what's happening in humanities is so completely disconnected from reality and real concerns of real people. It's all about theory, critical theory, and you have to be in line with critical theory. Um, and so, how and at what point feminists became anti-Semitic, it's Phyllis's article that she recently published on what happened in Copenhagen at a UN meeting in Denmark was, to me, both shocking and not, because again, it fits into my understanding that already in the 1970s, we see this movement on the left away from Jews and away from Israel and away from Zionism. And I think it encompasses all of the factions on the left. So if you consider yourself of the left, as I think I mentioned before, you have to embrace the anti-Israelism in the same way that you embrace anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism and anti-racism. And so it becomes actually unacceptable already in the 70s to say something in favor of Israel or Zionist thought or anything like that. And so I think that already begins to happen in the 70s, and people like Phyllis noticed it. She mentioned someone who I also know well, Gloria Greenfield, who's become a filmmaker, and I gave an interview to her latest film recently. She was also part of that wave of feminists who at some point see it, and it's a turning point for them to realize that the movement that they loved so much, that made so much sense, has become completely anti-Semitic. The class that I took in the early 90s at the University of Colorado in Boulder didn't have any of it. And I think it wasn't a central concern for the class, or for perhaps for feminist thought then. Maybe it belonged on the really radical parts of the left. Boulder, Colorado is a liberal university. So I'm sure everything I learned there was taught from the liberal perspective, meaning left of center perspective, but centrist, and so there wasn't anything, to my mind now, looking back, there wasn't absolutely anything radical about it. But yeah, I think what we saw after October 7th wasn't new, but I think it represented the moral bankruptcy of feminism, of the latest iteration of feminism. Because if you call yourself a feminist and you can't stand up in any way, shape, or form, or you can't even express solidarity with the Israeli women who experienced rape, that sexual violence was such an obvious and prominent part of what happened on October 7th. If you can't do it, then you're not a feminist. You're not even really part of the left. So I think that what it was just like, it's when everybody probably, it's when it broke into the mainstream. It's when it became so clear to so many more people, just the utter bankruptcy of these latest iterations of various left-wing movements.
It's interesting you bring up things like the critical theories that you have to agree to if you want to be on the left. The same as a student, you have to just accept those theories as being fundamental, true, that and any digression from that is racist, colonialist, all the rest of it. And I want to sort of bring our conversation to a close. I mean, there are so many questions I wish to ask you. You have to come back, and we have to continue this conversation. But you talk at the end, that final chapter is about assimilation and about these sort of as a Jews who supported the USSR, supported communism. Some who rose up the ranks. You talk about, gosh, I'm trying to remember the gentleman's mother who was very well assimilated, Smuckler, very well assimilated, very high up in the party.
Right.
And this idea of if you just hide all your Jewishness, you hide anything to do with it, your culture, denounce Israel, then you will be okay. And we see that today with sort of Jewish people who are going on the Free Palestine marches, who denounce Israel, and who are used time and time again to say, look, see, you can be Jewish and denounce Israel. This is the good Jew. We platformed a story just the other day. I don't know if you've seen our Substack. One of our members, who is a non-Jewish woman married to an Israeli man, and she talked about how his grandmother was really worried about that marriage and said it doesn't matter how left-wing and progressive her friends and family and are, at the end of the day, you're still a Jew and you will always be a Jew. And that has really hit home today in a post-October 7th world of her family and friends, denouncing and turning on her family now, her in-laws and her husband. I wonder if you can share with us sort of why you decided to sort of end with that chapter around that idea of that as a Jew, assimilation versus the lived experience that you cannot get rid of this being Jewish.
Well, I felt that I needed to address it because it is such a big part of the contemporary experience, and it's something that so many people find so troubling. I mean, I'm always asked this question every time I give a talk about the book. I'm asked, well, what do we do with Jews who are anti-Zionist, condemn Israel as genocidal, and I want to just be clear again for your listeners, we're not just talking about people who are critical, let's say, of the government of Israel or of its policies. That's obviously completely legitimate and normal. But people who just condemn the country, with everybody else without really getting into the details or follow an extremely biased and limited interpretation of events that essentially comes, we've seen throughout the war in Gaza how so much of it was just mainstream media essentially taking dictation from Hamas in terms of the numbers of casualties and what Israel was doing. Real, journalistic malpractice. And so people want to ask, well, what do we do? Here are Jews who are confirming all of this, and then they're used by the media as examples. Nobody wants to listen. And this is, by the way, also, we have to notice that the media loves to use Jews who are willing to condemn their own people. There's a long history to it. It's partly why I wrote about it. And I think it's why did I write about it? I mean, again, I think it's important for people to understand there is a history to it, that it's not just a recent phenomenon. I think also I wanted people to understand that actually when Jews join this movement that are hostile to their own people, it actually doesn't end well for them anyway, historically. And we actually already see it in the current moment. On social media, we've seen these well-known Jewish personalities who have condemned Israel from the beginning and all the way through the war, now being attacked, including Peter Beinart, Ezra Klein, people, really well-known people who have, or certainly Peter Beinart, who declared his allegiance clearly with the Palestinian side, condemning Israel every step of the way. Suddenly, people like him being attacked by the Palestinian side and essentially saying that it's not good enough. It's not good enough that he has condemned Zionism and Israel. Also, that Judaism itself is a problem, that religion itself is a problem. And so, what I'm trying to say here is that when Jews are asked to surrender their identity, there's often this salami tactic. This is the Soviet history is a good example there. Just give up this. Just give up your Zionism, or give up your religion, or give up Hebrew and Yiddish, and then you will have everything you want. So it's like, just give up this, give up this, give up this, and in the end, you're left with nothing. But you will still be hated. And so it's partly directed at people who may be tempted to follow those steps, and I think there may be a lot of temptation, and I don't blame people. It's like some people do it for ideological reasons, and some people do it just because it seems like, okay, well, it's an easier way to live. And what I'm saying is that, unfortunately, it's just not ultimately an answer. And in the end, what you end up with very often is a situation that Natan Sharansky describes so well, and I describe it in the book, in a situation where you're essentially living a double life. You let's say you decide, okay, well, I don't need to tell people that I go to a synagogue at work. I don't need to tell them that I went to Israel in the summer. I don't need to tell them, I can remove my Star of David. They don't need to know that I'm Jewish. You end up leading a double life. You always have to watch every word you say at work, for example, or in school. At home, you're one thing. In the outside world, you're something else. And the psychological toll of that life is really high. And so I wanted to communicate that message as well, because I think that people living in the free world can't appreciate just how hard this life is. Those of us who come from there understand it. And Tabarovsky writes about how, once he was essentially forced to declare his decision to emigrate to everybody, he dreaded this conversation. He dreaded the conversation with his boss, to tell him that he plans to emigrate. But then once he has these conversations, he feels this incredible feeling of release, because for the first time, he is free and he's whole. He can say what he means what he says. There's a wholeness that can't be replaced with anything. So these are some of the reasons, and also I think I wanted to say that, radical movements, like in the Soviet case, there was a radical group of Jews in the early years in the 1920s who participated in the project of essentially eliminating Zionism and Judaism and also the language Hebrew from Jewish communities. And it's like, on the one hand, a very small group of radicals can really change a culture. And so we shouldn't underestimate them. On the other hand, they don't end well. And on the third hand, there is also a positive message in that. And that is that if a small group of ideologically determined people can change a culture, then I think that Jews who decide to stand for themselves and Jews who decide to be defiant and courageous, and this is the ultimate message of the book, can be successful. Like, everybody doesn't need to fight to the same intensity. If we it's like, not everybody was like Sharansky, not everybody can be like Sharansky, not everybody even needs to be like Sharansky. But I think a lot of people need to agree that it's a time to fight. They can just fight in their own way. They can contribute in their own way. They don't have to be at the front of the movement. They can be supporting the movement. They can be, countering lies in their own lives. So there are many ways to do this, but I think it begins with the message of courage and defiance and determination to really reclaim what is yours and not surrender what is yours just because society demands it.
That's a really lovely place to end this chat. There's a story that you tell about Sharansky of whether it's legend, myth, or reality of being told to sort of walk straight, but from east to west, as he was finally freed, and he zigzagged because he would not do what he was told. And it made me think of the hostages that were held in the Hamas tunnels and the big parades that Hamas held and the handover, the gross spectacles, but the little moments of defiance that some of those hostages were able to commit in those moments, the fists raised instead of the thank you, the walking away, that connection, that through line of history and what is happening today is so powerful throughout the book.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been really great to speak with you. As I say, I really hope you will come back and speak with us more when we sort of get the 35 story up and on its feet and hopefully get some of those women chatting with us. I'm so looking forward to it.
I would love to. I'd be very happy to. And I want to say, along with Phyllis Chesler, who I know was so grateful to learn about your group and to be part of this podcast. I'm so happy that we have feminists who see the total moral inversion of what's going on today and are willing to fight. And I will be more than happy to come back. And thank you so much. It's just been such a pleasure to meet you early in London and to talk to you now.
Thank you.